All right, folks. So welcome to our social work votes and licensure panel. I'm so excited so many folks could be here and join us today. Um, Probably should be record. Oh, no, we are recording. We're all set. All right. So hi, everybody. My name is Dana Paglia King. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy for NASW Michigan. I stepped into this role in late July, so I might just be meeting some of y'all for the first time. Maybe you've seen me around at some of our meetings and committees, but either way, I'm super excited to be here. This event's super exciting for me today as well. I'm a Wayne State graduate, so the fact that NASW Michigan, my new place of employment, and a group that I really loved as I joined as a student, but also where I graduated from with my MSW and my undergrad in anthropology. I'm just super excited that this event could come together. A couple of housekeeping things. We have Roberto on who will be helping with the CEs. So if you're here for the 1.5 CEs, Roberto is your person for that and will be helping us out. As Dwayne said, the recording will be available on our YouTube page next week. And then if you are here as a Wayne State student for those extra credit points that are being offered, make sure you are staying in attendance for the full meeting. The attendance report from the Zoom will be sent over to Wayne State staff and faculty, and that is how they will double check. So make sure your name's accurate and make sure you're staying because they're going to be going off of the attendance report. So to give folks a breakdown for today's event, and I do apologize, I have a bit of a raspy voice. I'm coming over a cold. If you've worked with me this week, you've heard the progression of my voice all week. It's been super fun. We have some really fabulous speakers today. So we have Dean Cheryl Kubiak from Wayne State kicking us off, followed by Representative Felicia Brabeck. And then we're going to end tonight with a licensure panel featuring Dwayne Breziak from NASW Michigan, Damon Creighton, who is also a graduate of Wayne State School of Social Work as well as University of Michigan, and then Brian Victor with Wayne State University. I'm going to encourage folks that if you have questions throughout the evening, throw them in the chat, but we will do our best to ensure some Q&A time at the end. So without further ado, I'm super excited that I have the opportunity to introduce Dean Cheryl Kubiak. Like I said, I'm a warrior through and through for my undergrad and my graduate. Even got to work under Dean Cheryl Kubiak for a brief period of time this year. So Dean Kubiak, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dana, and many thanks to NASW and Judith and Andre, particularly at Wayne State, for putting this together. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here to talk about advocacy and political advocacy, politics, and licensure. All things that I'm very, very passionate about, just like you are as social workers. As social workers, we're kind of professional advocates, right? We are tenacious in our advocacy, whether it's for an individual or whether it's for an issue, whether it's for a group, but we know how to advocate. And advocacy can take many forms. But as any of you who have a family member or yourself maybe involved in a medical situation recently, you know that unless you have an advocate with you at the hospital, or you continue to advocate for yourself in that medical system, you can get lost in the system. So just like that can happen to any one of us, we know that the clients that we serve that may not have the resources or the networks or the technological capabilities that we have, we know that sometimes we have to be the voice for or empower people to advocate for themselves. And that advocacy is one of the reasons why I went into social work. Some of us are just natural advocates, right? We're always for the underdog, and we're always working to think about how we can make someone's life that much easier. When we're working as social workers in clinical settings or individual practice, we are often advocating for one individual. And often we're advocating for a lot of individuals on our caseloads. And we start to see patterns in that advocacy. We start to see that we're challenging the same systems, or we're finding these same problems, or that everyone on your caseload is experiencing the same problem. And when you start to see that this is not one person's issue, that this is more of a system or a systemic issue, then your advocacy needs to take a different form. It's not individual advocacy anymore. It's got to be systems level advocacy. And that may be a policy, it may be a practice, it may be an individual who's in a position of power who should not be. But when you're looking at system level advocacy, you have some different tools that you need to employ. Now, I can tell you that as a social work MSW student, I was one of those strange folks that was a policy major. Because I was a non-traditional student, and when I came back, I had several years in the field and kind of was fired up on certain issues. I had been working in mental health institutions and then later in prisons with women who were pregnant and incarcerated. And those issues that I noted were systemic in nature. I realized I couldn't help just one person at a time, that it would be like putting my finger in a dike and hoping that it didn't flood over, because there were so many people with the same problems. So then when you move into policy work and you move into action on policy, you have some choices about political advocacy and issue advocacy. And political advocacy means working with individual candidates, and that could be trying to get a particular person that you know shares your values and ethics and getting them elected. It may be fundraising for that individual. It may be canvassing, going door to door. Any of you who are involved in this particular election may be involved in some of those things, because there's so much activity right now and so much importance in getting out the vote and getting your vote out, that we're all involved in this political advocacy right now. But that's not the only kind of advocacy there is at that system level. And sometimes there's what we call issue advocacy and issue politics. And that's when you are looking at a particular issue and trying to think about how you can move that issue forward. This often is a much longer process, and it takes more than an election cycle. Right? Politics, you come and you go. Sometimes it's a 2-year cycle for House representatives, or a 4-year cycle for a president, or 6-year cycle for a senator. And that's one type of advocacy to get people in office that we can partner with on issue advocacy. But issue advocacy also means building coalitions and collaborating with people who are experiencing similar issues or have the same goals. So I want to give you some examples of what issue advocacy might look like. So one of my major areas of concern is around criminal legal reform. And there are some issues that we have worked on for decades, and I am not kidding, decades. And sometimes we get something happening, like, for instance, when I was working with women who were incarcerated and pregnant, they used to shackle women during pregnancy, actually have chains on them during labor and delivery. And as we were able to change that policy, we thought we had a victory, only to find out that when a new administration came in for the department, they reinstituted that policy. So sometimes just because you've solved that issue once doesn't mean that it's forever gone. Another issue that we've been working on quite a while now is the issue of social work licensure. And social work licensure, as many of you know, has an exam component of it that many of us believe is not a valid exam, and that it is hindering people from practicing their social work profession. Now, building a coalition around advocacy, around changing that, is a formidable task. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about that later. But what I want to say to you is that there's coalition building that's necessary around issues. We partner with the NASW, all the deans and the directors of the schools of social work. There's 13 graduate programs in Michigan. We all work together to form a coalition and have one voice. We just sent in a letter today to NASW of all the deans and directors advocating for licensure change around this exam. But sometimes it also means partnering with people you wouldn't normally partner with. So we'll say the Michigan Hospital Association is sometimes on one side of an issue and on another side of an issue. And sometimes we may agree with them and sometimes we may not. On this issue, they're with the coalition and they're working hard to change that. The CMH Board Association is another partner in our coalition building. But the stronger our coalition and the more voices that rise up around an issue, the better you are in terms of situating your voice in the issue. So we are partnering with legislators, as you'll hear from Representative Brabeck. We're partnering with these many organizations, and we're partnering nationally with NASW, CSWE, and the National Association of Black Social Workers and Latinx social workers. So building those coalitions is a really, really important tool in issue advocacy. But the thing that I want to leave all of you with before I turn this back over to Dana is this, is that please do not underestimate your skills and your knowledge. I believe that as social workers, we sometimes second guess our perceptions about things. And we think that maybe we're not smart enough, maybe we don't know enough. But I believe that we have a common sense approach to this work that is rare. We can see connections between issues and people. We can see paths forward that others don't often see. So I want you, as you go forward in your profession, to honor that social work voice within you. And what you know intuitively is the advocacy role that you need to take. You have a lot of knowledge, you have a lot of passion, and you have a lot of skills that either you already possess or you are learning. Please honor your own wisdom and your own role in changing what is unjust in this world. So thank you very much for being here tonight. I look forward to hearing from others on the panel. And Dana, back to you.
Thank you so much, Dean Kubiak, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insights. We're so lucky to have you on our call today. And again, go Warriors. I saw that Representative Brabeck hopped on the call, and I'm super excited that she is able to join us today. I can only imagine how busy you are, Representative Brabeck, with all the things between the upcoming election, what's going on in the House right now in general. But Representative Felicia Brabeck is with us tonight. She is the sponsor of our licensing bills and also has just been a true ally for social work values during her time in the House. So, Representative Brabeck, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thanks, Dana. I really appreciate it. It's so great to be here with everyone. I'm so excited to be with all these social workers. Just so you know a little bit about me, so kind of can put this in some perspective. So I have my master's degree in clinical social work. So I, like you, have, well, maybe not like many of you. I feel like I'm very old. And so I've been doing this now for a while, 30 years next year. So, um, and I did clinical. And so done therapy. And then I went back and got my doctorate in clinical psychology. And so I love doing therapy with people. I love supervising. I still do that work to a much lesser degree now. But Dean Kubiak could not be more on point in that the skills that we learn and practice and hone over years I use them every day in the work that I get to do in the legislature. And so we can talk a little bit about that. But one of the things that I like to say when I get to be in groups of kind of my kindred spirits and warriors in mental health care is please, please think about being in elected office. There aren't as many of us. There needs to be more of us, and the perspective that we bring is truly unique. And our Dean Kubiak is saying our brains work differently. Like we see the issues differently. We bring voices to the table that oftentimes are not there. And so I want to invite all of you on this Zoom to really think about how you might be engaged in this world. And there's so many different ways to do this, but your voice is so important. I was actually thinking, Dean Kubiak, when you were talking, I was thinking about all of my classes back in social work school. And, I remember like I had policy classes, even though I was in the clinical track, I had policy classes and I loved them. And they were very hard, very, very hard. And if you can believe it, if I'm not sure of the ages of folks on here, but we read in one of my policy classes, we read The Contract for America. So Newt Gingrich, so way back, we read that and we really examined it and critically thought about it. And it was great. But policy classes are invaluable. Your interpersonal. Oh, I'm sorry. All those thumbs up and fireworks stuff go off. Your interpersonal classes obviously are really important because the basis of this work that we get to do is all the relationships that we get to form, nurture. That's so important. And then the other classes that, I feel like all of them, but the one that I thought of when Dean Kubiak was speaking was your group classes, learning about group dynamics, and how groups come together, how they fall apart, the way that they kind of maneuver and work. It is fascinating to have this knowledge from our training and be in the public world. So cherish your classes, learn everything that you can. If I could go back to school, I would. I love school so much. And so I love that you all are engaged. But here's why I also want to tell you. So I truly, truly want you all to think about being in public office during my first cycle. So I've been a rep. This is the end of my 4th year. During my first 2 years, I was the only mental health care provider out of 110 representatives in the state house, the only one. And yet, so many people wanted to say that they were mental health care champions and wanted to do what's right. And I'm not saying that they can't or won't or don't, but they didn't have our training. And I'll give you an example. A dear friend of mine, he was working on a bill, and dear friend and colleague, he was working on a bill, and we do it now. It allows for the Secretary of State to put on an insignia on either our state IDs or a driver's license. And folks who are either hard of hearing or who are on the spectrum can apply to have this little badge on their ID or license, so that if they should have any interaction with the police, their behaviors or the way that they're interacting isn't put through a different sort of filter. So they have some more data when they're interacting with our neighbors. And so he had this bill, thought it was a great idea. I liked it. And I'm reading the bill and I'm going through, and there are all these folks who could diagnose ASD, and but psychologist wasn't on there at all. And like psychologists are the ones who do the testing for this, and right, like all this stuff. And so I like read it again. I was like, man, I must be missing it, right? And I wasn't, right? And it wasn't because someone was doing something nefarious. It was simply an oversight by folks who don't know our fields as well as we do. And so literally on the floor, that bill was changed and then it got voted on. And so our presence makes a difference. This cycle, I've been joined by a couple of other folks. So there's two folks who have MSWs. One is a researcher and one is a works in the foster care system, or used to, excuse me. And then we have a member who has a BSW. And so folks it was great. Like we got more folks in the mental health care world. And so that has helped some. So here's why voting matters, and we'll talk a little bit about voting and engagement. And I have a website I can put into the chat for you all in a little bit. But for us, voting matters because whoever is in charge, that matters. And so, for us, we were able to do things this term that haven't been able to be done in decades. And so we were able to do things like address reproductive rights, common sense gun legislation. We repealed the pension tax. We did a working families tax. We expanded Elliott Larson. So a number of things that we worked on. And it was because of the constellation that we have in the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. Now, some of the margins that we won those seats by were very small. And the smallest margin was by 600 votes. Right, so that's not very many, right? Like, so only 600, and so it matters that people show up. People often say, "Well, my vote doesn't matter; it doesn't count. It's just one thing, or just one vote." I've heard that from lots of folks. And one of my colleagues who used to be in the House with me and then was termed out, he ran for county commission. The very first time that he ran for county commission, he won by one vote, literally one vote. And he went on to be a state representative and to be in leadership for 4 years as a state representative. And again, he won by one vote. They actually did a recount and then he won by 2. But that original one, he was just one vote. The original count was by one vote. And so votes do matter. One of the things that folks can overlook, because we can be so focused on what's going on at the national level, is that that all of your local electeds, a lot of them make decisions that impact you on a daily basis that sometimes are very seamless. You might not even realize it, but those elections are so important. So it's important to do your homework, understand who the people are, and know who you're voting for, particularly at your townships, your villages, your county commissions, your cities. Those are invaluable. So now, obviously, we have an election coming up, 11 days till election, but I think all of us are counting down to this election right now, at least in my world. I have been all over the state, knocking doors, talking to people. Earlier this week, I was in Traverse City. Today, I was in Battle Creek. On Monday, I'll be in Marquette, up in the UP. We're everywhere, making sure that we're talking with voters about not only what we've been able to do, but what the future can look like. And so we're going into the period of early voting. So I want to put this, I hope I'm not super techie. So let me see if I can figure this out, how to do this. I want to put this in the chat for you all. So that in case folks, tomorrow for many areas, there are a couple that started a little bit earlier. The early voting period has started. And so here we go. there you go. There's the second. Oh no, that's not right. I'm not doing this right. Everyone. There we go. Okay, there we go. That is the link to the Secretary of State's website that you can put your address in there, and then it will tell you your locations where you can vote early. So please take a look at that. You also can look at your sample ballot, all those kinds of things. And so I take advantage of the things that our Secretary of State has made available to us. They're great. It's just, it's wonderful, from my opinion, that we have someone in office who wants to make voting much more accessible to folks and not put up hurdles to folks being able to vote. So I want to highlight, the last thing I want to highlight is who, in my opinion, who is in office matters. And both Dana and Dean Kubiak talked about the social work licensure bills. And I can tell you that it has been very interesting working with my colleagues across the aisle on these bills. And unfortunately, the reaction from some of them on the Behavioral Health Committee has been more of at least the way that I understand their stances, more of a reaction that is in line with ASWB. And this test is really important for all these reasons. And I keep asserting that a test doesn't mean that you're a good social worker or a good therapist or a good, like that doesn't, one does not equate to another. And if we're gonna have something, let's have something that's actually reasonable. I think supervision is it, but if I had my druthers, we'd have supervision and more kind of scaffolding around supervision. But that is, I don't get to make that decision by myself. So we're continuing to work on this, but it matters, right? It matters that folks, it matters that, sorry, I have to take off, this chat is going on, I'm like distracted by that. Okay. So it matters in terms of who is in those seats, because I know that my colleagues across the aisle say that they want to help with mental health and they want to, like, I understand it, but when it has come down to it, almost every time it has come down to it this cycle, they have either passed or voted no. Very few things they have voted yes on. And so it matters, right? There are so many things that I actually just met with our legislative director for our caucus, because there are three major things that I'm trying to pass in our lame duck session, which means like after the election, before the next cycle begins. Social work licensure is one of them. There was an issue for master's level psychologists that we've gotten worked out around their supervision, because they, as statute is right now, they have to have supervision for their entire career, no matter how long they've been practicing for. So we have a fix for that. We have, I don't know how many of you are familiar with CCBHCs, Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinics. So that deals with access for folks. So it allows folks to walk through, if there is an organization that is a CCBHC, a person can walk through that door and get help regardless of the acuity of what's going on for them, and insurance agnostic, right? And that's not how our world usually works. But Senator Stabenow has worked really hard to put this in place nationally. We have several here in our state, and I am actually working with one of my Republican colleagues on that to codify that language. So we're hoping that passes. And then the last mental health care bill that I'm hoping will pass is a bill on saying that the commercial insurance companies cannot, or they must use, when they're deciding if they are going to approve or deny services, they have to base that on our collective clinical standards of practice. They cannot use their own proprietary criteria as they're able to now. And so those are major bills that in our world that I think are really important. And we're going to continue to push and work on them. if we don't get these across the finish line, then the process starts over again in January with new sponsors, and we keep working. I mean, I can tell you that these bills can take a very long time. The master's level psychologist one that I shared with you, people have worked on this one for 30 years. So it can take a while. Now, I do not want social work licensure to take that long at all. I'm hoping and doing all that we can to get that across the finish line this time. And so we're just going to keep working. But who is in these seats matters, because what we bring to this work is really important. Like I said, our viewpoint and our interests in things. And if we're not there, then sometimes these issues aren't addressed, and that's just not okay. And so again, I just want to go back to where I started. Please, please, please think about being in public office. We want folks to do that. And so I am grateful for the time today. Thank you so much. I don't know if you're wanting us to do questions. I'm sorry about that.
No,
Did I do all the things you wanted me to do?
you did everything and
Okay.
more, Representative Brayback.
Okay.
Thank you so much for
Sure.
joining us tonight. I know you've been so busy doing all the things this year, or this time of year, I should say, really, but all throughout the year. We haven't had any questions in the chat. I know you have another
Okay.
event coming up.
It's okay.
You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like, but thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for all that you do day in and day out to help all of our residents and folks in our communities. What you do is invaluable, and I am indebted to you. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy she was able to join us tonight, y'all. All right. So to kind of bring us to a close as we wrap up this last hour here, we have our licensure panel. Oops, give me 1 second here because this is what happens when I share my screen and it's in full screen. That's okay. I can make it work. So we have three fabulous social workers with us today for our licensure panel. We have, I mean, licensure is the hot topic right now. Dean Kubiak discussed it, Representative Brayback discussed it, and now we have three experts from kind of different parts of the story getting ready to discuss it. So I have a question prepared for each of them. So we're going to start with Brian Victor, and as I prompt each of you, if you want to introduce yourselves as well, give us some background. We have three really unique perspectives from licensure with us today. So first up is Brian Victor, who is going to share with us. Your prompt is, over the last 20 years, we haven't really had a review on Michigan's licensure process and what that looks like. So Brian, can you kind of talk about some of the barriers you've identified in your research and what we could be doing differently maybe?
Sure. Well, first, just want to say hello to everyone. It's good to be with you this evening. I'm Brian Victor. I'm a faculty member in the School of Social Work at Wayne State. And for the past year or so, I've been doing research in this area related to the licensing exam and been involved in some of the advocacy efforts, both here in Michigan and nationally, to try and address this. As Brayback had kind of alluded to, licensure is regulated by the states, and so we need a 50-state solution, plus the District of Columbia and other areas in order to resolve this. But the problem is common to all of us, and that would be the ASWB licensing exams. So I think about 20 years ago, when we first established licensure in the state and introduced testing requirements, I don't think we knew quite as much about the ASWB exams as we do now. And really the information that we have about the impact of using those tests and the disparate racial impact that it has on our profession make it kind of a very central racial justice issue that we address. And also we have an accumulated evidence that the exams themselves are not valid measures. That is, we have extensive evidence and as maybe I'll talk about a little bit later, lack of evidence that the exams are able to distinguish between those who can effectively and safely practice social work and those who can't. And so we kind of, I think, with good intentions 20 years ago, tried to set up a regulatory framework for for the profession, to get ourselves licensure, to sustain us. For clinicians to be able to bill, extremely important to be reimbursed for the work that they do. But I think now, after 20 years of implementation, we have a moment to pause and realize and reflect on whether or not it's working. And I think the resounding answer is that it's not, and that we're in desperate need of reform, and a reform that removes the ASWB exams from the process and moves us towards more equitable and effective alternatives to that. So I'll pause there, but I think that's, as I see it, we started with good intentions 20 years ago, and we have enough evidence and experience and practice wisdom now to know it's time for a change.
And then Brian, I believe you also had, I don't know if you have it ready to go, but was there some materials that you wanted to share with the group, some of the data points that you've
Yeah, sure. So
Yeah.
I have just a few slides that I want to go
Stop
through.
sharing?
My hope is just as we move towards a deeper conversation about the Social Work Modernization Act within the state, that I want to kind of set the stage and show us, kind of make a case or show you some of the data to back up my claim around why I think it's so urgent that we take action, why I believe it is a racial justice issue, and that the exams themselves are not valid measures, and so they don't actually serve the purpose that they're intended to within the licensure process. Yeah, I will go ahead and share my screen here. Give me just a moment.
Brian's really going to set the stage for the rest of the conversation that we're going to have with Dwayne and Damon, kind of showing some of the narrative work that's going on. But Brian's really going to set the stage and get into some of the nitty gritty with what's going on with the ASWB exam. So thank you so much, Brian.
Sure. So yeah, I just want to make a case for why these exams are terrible and that they need to go, which is something I think many people know intuitively from having taken them and seeing them up close. But again, a note that when I say ASWB, I'm referring to the Association of Social Work Boards. This is a nonprofit based in Virginia that develops and administers the exam. And in many states, through statute, individuals are required to take that exam. And so it's a proprietary test developed by just one organization, one alleged nonprofit that makes an awful lot of money off of the test that it sells without a lot of support to back it up. And in fact, over the past few years, they've made millions of dollars off of the test with no evidence to support its use. So here I go, real quick. So for the past, so for decades, and we're talking about these licensure exams have been in use in various states for many years, less so in Michigan. We're compared to other states, relatively new to the game in terms of licensure. But since really shortly after their inception, advocates had been requesting data from the ASWB out of the suspicion that there were disparities in terms of pass rates, and that there was a suspicion that those disparities were often around dimensions of race or of age or of first language. And ASWB as a nonprofit was not compelled to release those, but after many years of advocacy by many folks, in August of 2022, they did release their pass rate report. And so this was data that came from the testing company themselves. There's a lot going on this slide, but just at a high level, this is information about pass rates for the clinical exam. What it shows, kind of the line graphs show pass rate on the first time taking the exam, and it's broken down here by race. But they also share the eventual pass rates. That is, for people who take the test 1, 2, 3, upwards of 10 times, 12 times in some cases, what's the eventual pass rate by race? For white test takers, that's at 91%. For black test takers, the number is around 57% as terms of their eventual pass rate on the clinical exam. And this is when I say this is a racial justice issue. What I mean is we've set up a regulatory structure in Michigan and across the country in which 43% of Black social workers who seek a clinical license complete 2 years of their MSW training, pay that tuition, do at least 2 years of supervision in the field only to be stopped by this exam from advancing within their career. A full 43% of people who set out on that. And the numbers are troubling kind of across the board. For the clinical exam, also in terms of pass rate by age, the eventual pass rate for those 18 to 29 is 91% at the time they start taking it. But for those 50 and older, the pass rate is around 65%. These are pass rates that are pretty equivalent across both the BSW, the bachelor's exam, and the master's exam, which we don't use here in Michigan, but others do in other states. And then looking at the disparities by first language. And so for those for whom English is their first language, a pass rate of 83%, but only 70. So I just want to highlight just the strong inequities and the disparate impact on our profession that's generated by using the exam. Once this report came out, national NASW came out in strong opposition to the exams, and in fact called for us to discontinue their use within the licensure process. And ASWB themselves, the nonprofit that profits from the exam, has referred to the discrepancies in the data as unacceptable, and yet they do a bit of a nefarious twist here at the end and say, well, these are disparities that we see across standardized testing broadly, and that they often reflect the inequities that are present throughout society. And so they try and deflect the attention away from the exam itself and put it back onto the test taker. And so it raises this strong question is that are the exams that ASWB develops, are they good and valid measures, and it's a problem with the test takers who need to prepare for it, or are the exams themselves flawed? And what I want to just kind of share and emphasize is that all publicly available and independently established evidence says that these exams are fundamentally flawed, and there's no empirical or research support to back up their use for their intended purpose. And so kind of one of the few flaws I want to highlight is this notion of predictive validity. This is just a fancy term that academics use to try and sound smart. And it's really just about, does the exam do what it says? Can it sort us into groups? Can I take the exam and it categorizes me as I am safe and ethical and ready for practice, or no, I'm not ready for that type of practice? If we're going to use the exam within our licensure process for such a high stakes decision as whether or not to be able to advance your career, then we would want to have some strong evidence to say the test can do what it says it does. I think ASWB felt that same way, and they could feel kind of a pressure for reform. And so they commissioned a researcher out at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and they said, can you scan the academic literature, the research, and show us examples that would support the use of the exam? Dr. Kim out at Rutgers did an extensive review of all of the published literature, and she came back to ASWB empty-handed, and she said, I'm sorry, there's nothing out there that supports the use of the exams, nothing in terms of evidence that would say the exam is good at differentiating between those ready to practice and those not. And so ASWB released put out a press release, and I just want to highlight what they say here at the end. They say, well, there's a very little documentation and research specific to regulatory practices. In other words, the reality is much bleaker than they expected in terms of the support for the exam. The other flaw I want to highlight, Dana, how am I doing on time? Just a couple more minutes. Okay, great. Just stop me if I fit that limit. And I can always come back to this. The other flaws I want to talk about are just in how the exam itself is structured and the types of questions that are asked. So if you've sat for the exam or prepared for the exam, you'll know that oftentimes it's scenario-based exam questions. It will give you maybe 2-3 lines of context, and then it will say, given this scenario, what should the social worker do first? Or what would be the best course of action, the best way forward? It's trying to mimic real-world practice in just 2 sentences, 3 sentences, which is, I think, as all of us know, not enough space to kind of capture the real complexity of the context-based decisions that we make. And yet, this is the structure. This is the way that the test is set up. I want to talk a little bit about some findings from a study that Dean Kubiak and I did with some of our colleagues at the University of Michigan. Here we actually had ChatGPT take the exam, and then we reflected on its answers. We actually didn't really need ChatGPT to tell us about all the problems in the exam, but our evaluation and consideration of ChatGPT's responses helped to draw our attention and highlight some of the real issues and flaws in how the exam is designed. So the first piece I want to talk about is the use of empirically unsupported test items. This is ASWB relying on outdated or faulty science to support its decision as to what is the right answer on its exams. And so here is one example of that. And this was an item that actually appeared on the exam. And the question was, what emotional reaction will the adult children of a person recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease most likely demonstrate? Right? Immortality versus extinction, isolation, depression, or denial. ASWB claims that the correct answer to that is D, denial, based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief model. And so they're relying on that model to justify the correct answer. ChatGPT went a different route and said, C, depression. But in its response and justification to us, they said, well, I'm just trying to guess. I'm just trying to give you an answer since you asked for one. But the reality is the experiences of grief are really varied across humans. And we can't have, at least existing evidence hasn't said that there's a uniform way to grieve or a response under these circumstances. And that's really backed up by science. In fact, a number of health researchers have cautioned explicitly against using Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief model because it could, in fact, pathologize the way that people are experiencing grief. And so here we have an example of the ASWB not even using the best available science, the best available evidence in order to determine what the right answers are. It's a real problem for the inferences we might make because someone might rightfully not use the stages of grief model, but they would have gotten that question wrong. And the second, or this is the third and the last one I'll highlight for now, is that the scenarios that are provided to us are required that you choose one of the available answers. So in this scenario, this is kind of some decision making in the child welfare context. It says a 6-year-old child lives with a foster family. His family is in prison and his mother is in residential treatment for alcohol dependence. The child is small for his age, often has temper outbursts, and has difficulty completing schoolwork. The social worker notes that his speech is immature. What should the social worker do first? Provides these 4 options. ASWB said that the correct answer was to make a referral for fetal alcohol syndrome. ChatGPT actually disagreed here and instead said, no, actually, none of these answers are the correct ones. They said, I would choose none of these because we simply don't have enough information provided to us in the context to do that. We checked with our colleagues who hold a lot of clinical expertise, and they really agreed, saying that ASWB is forcing social workers into choosing options that may themselves not be the best way forward. And so it's artificially trying to construct decision-making scenarios that don't allow us to consider even an evidence-based practice framework where we hear and understand the preferences of our clients and make sure that whatever we do moving forward is culturally responsive. And so I just want to bring these pieces into play. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, but just saying that as we're kind of contemplating modernization of our social work licensing framework, that we should take into account that we're working with a fundamentally flawed exam that doesn't do what it claims to do.
Thank you so much, Brian. You've done so much work on this, and I put it in the chat, and I know a lot of folks agree, but like having an exam like this that forces social workers to like put people in scenario and boxes, such rigid boxes at that, where in reality, like we're working with humans and we're working with communities, and humans and communities don't fit neatly into boxes. And that's like social work 101, I feel like, at like the very basic level of social work. So thank you for laying it out there and really painting the picture for what we're going to talk about the rest of the evening. Next up, we have Dwayne Brisiak, who I will allow him to introduce himself in just a moment. A lot of you are probably already familiar with him. And the question I have for you, Dwayne, so you can prepare is, can you share your thoughts on the recent calls to remove the ASWB exam or replace the ASWB exam? And what are some of the alternative pathways or assessments that could be better suited to ensure competency? And what are we kind of seeing across the country right now?
Yeah, thanks, Brian, Dean Kubiak, and Rep. Rayback. My name is Dwayne Brisiak. I use he, him pronouns for those of you who don't know me. I'm the executive director for NASW Michigan, and I have been with the chapter for 12 years now. So some of you might know me from the last roughly 10 years of doing licensure workshops for many of our schools of social work. So many of you may have received your initial licensing information from me from a workshop. But in the last several years, we really shifted our focus into this advocacy space. And I will say Michigan has been talking about licensing reform and issues within our current process for many years. The exam piece has created a faster momentum in the last 2 years since the exam data was released by ASWB. Some of the work that we've been done in Michigan over the last couple of years is prior to 2022, when ASWB released their information, we worked with our schools of social work and Lara to get Michigan's information around our own passing score. Partially going back to what Brian said earlier is that ASWB refused and said that data related to the exam score did not exist. And so we wanted to find a way to track our own Michigan folks as best as possible. So our schools hired a researcher to look at our own pass rates here in Michigan. And right before that data was about to be released, ASWB released their national report. So I know we put some pressure on to get this out nationally, and I'm glad that it is. And once that jar was opened, there's no turning back nationally. And so we've seen a monumental shift in how people are talking about this than we ever before. The one thing that makes Michigan a little bit different in this conversation is because we were the second to last state to get licensing passed in the United States. It wasn't until 2005 that Michigan got licensing, that about a third of all of our practicing social workers in Michigan didn't take the exam to begin with. So we have a roughly 10,000 licensed social workers who are agency directors, supervisors, senior leaders in our profession who don't have higher unethical practice, don't have other issues because they didn't take this one metric. So I think that that's where we've had a little shifted narrative in our state and maybe seen less pushback than some of the states who have been trying to move this and have had licensing for 30 or 40 years longer than Michigan. So to give some context about what's kind of going on nationally, we've seen many states have to take some slightly different approaches to how they look at the examination. Going back to kind of what Rep. Rayback and what Dean Kubiak mentioned is each state legislature is also very different. How to get something passed is going to be very different and depending on who's in office in each one of those states. There are some states that if you open up licensing, it's very possible that social work will get deregulated as a profession. We do not want that. Our goal is to have more licensed professionals in Michigan, more public protection, but just removing a really terrible barrier that's kept many people out of our current process. At the time, we're also restructuring tiers because Michigan is the only state that uses a limited license system for our initial level of licenses. So it's created issues with billing, credentialing, and it has a 6 renewal cap, which is part of also what's keeping people out from being able to stay practicing in the profession. They hit that cap mainly because of the examination, and then there's no way to continue to maintain a license here in Michigan. And so people are either having to leave the state or leave the profession, which we don't want. So in just the last year, we have seen many states, including Colorado, Utah, Rhode Island, and Maine, eliminating the social work exam requirements at the non-clinical spaces. Our neighbor state, Illinois, was the first state that created a pathway that didn't require examination or has a pathway at the clinical level that you have to attempt the exam once, but you can get additional supervised hours in Illinois and then be licensed at the clinical space. And then most recently, Minnesota now is really the first state that has created a full pathway that does not require an examination at any level. They use what they have as a provisional license for folks who didn't speak English as a first language and expanded that to include anybody. That's been a huge barrier with this process as well, as ASWB's exam is currently only available in English. There is allegedly it's coming in French in a couple of years because it's mandated by Canadian law. But we know that there's so many folks that speak other languages that are impacted by that one accessibility piece. Additionally, there have been bills introduced or work groups formed in at least 5 other states, including New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Washington, and Oregon. Oregon, most recently, their Board of Social Work put together a task force to look at alternative pathways. Their task force released their recommendations, and their recommendations also called for the abolition of the social work examination at every level. So we're seeing that states are taking slightly different approaches to how they're going about getting to what the proper thing is in their state, but they're coming to the same conclusion, which is really good to see. Michigan, we've been working in coalition, like Team Kubiak said, for several years on this now. Legislation is a long haul game. Regulatory change is a long haul game, but we really need to see some major pieces move quicker or sooner rather than later, so we can keep our people in our licensing here in Michigan. There are other options that are being looked at. What some of the options that Oregon looked at and some of our researchers have also been exploring is performance assessments or simulations, looking at oral examinations, portfolio-based examinations, jurisprudence tests, or provisional licensing. Our conversations with Laura and the governor's office, they're very hesitant to remove an examination requirement for a profession like social work, partially because every other health profession has an exam. And so they don't want social work to look like an outlier, even knowing the data that's out there related to the exam and its lack of proven measure of competency. So where we're at this point in kind of the negotiation phase and finding the Michigan-specific social work test. This would be an open book, open note, not gotcha questions, things that social workers need to know about the law and the rules that govern your license. So how many continuous do you have to need? How many members of the Board of Social Work? Who appoints the Board of Social Work? What are the ethical violations in Michigan? What sort of core competencies did you learn during your social work program? Those sort of baseline things that we need and should know by the time we enter the field. That seems to feel at this point like the middle ground of where we may find Laura and the governor at this point willing to support our work going forward. So we already have a working group that's pulled a lot of that together at this point, but it's going to still take, as Rep. Brabeck, some push from all of our social work community to get this across the finish line. And that may mean really quickly, lame duck is coming up, like she mentioned, between November 6th and the end of this calendar year. If we are able to get it across the finish line by the end of this calendar year, it will still not be implemented for 8. So I think for folks who are practicing now or wondering as a limited licensee, yes, this looks exciting. When is this going to actually be a thing? It takes time for Laura and the regulation to catch up with the law. They have to change their websites, all the things on the My Plus system. If we do have a state-specific exam, that has to get instituted through the proper channels. So we're looking still at probably the middle of 2026, probably before this would be the reality for folks. As we get to the election, I think the other thing that's really important that I didn't hear mentioned, we don't have our governor up for election this year, but when we think about what else is on the ballot unintentionally in some of our election, all of the appointments that happen at the state level, including all the social work members, folks who are appointed to cabinet level positions or work within the cabinet. Getting social workers into those spaces are really critical, as well as thinking about folks who work or are working as legislative liaisons to departments like LARA, MDHHS, and the governor's office. So social workers need and have played kind of a continuation and a helpful role connecting some of those dots. But we absolutely are going to need everyone's work as we continue to move this forward. And we need you to be talking to your fellow students, your colleagues, your agency directors, where there is conventional pressure is from organizations. Agencies have power. They hire people, they fire people. They're the ones providing services. So yes, the individuals are also really important in this, but if we could have more of the organizationals come out and say, hey, I've had to let 5 social workers go last year because they weren't able to pass their licensing exam, or annually we're looking at turnover of X amount of people. Those sort of data are really important on the ground. So, we're very excited. We are glad we'll hopefully still have folks in the House next year. I think I put into the chat earlier, Rep. Kafia, Rep. Edwards, and Rep. Reingans are all up for re-election, as is every one of the members of the Behavioral Health Subcommittee, which is where our bills currently reside. There are several of those folks in very competitive races, and there are some of those races that we would love to see flipped to a more supportive candidate. So just be looking at if you have your representative who's on that committee and they haven't made a statement about whether they would support this bill or sign on as a co-sponsor, you might want to ask them. And if they're not supportive, maybe consider voting for a different candidate in that region. So I'll stop my part there because I know we're short on time and we'll have some questions later, but I'd love to turn it back.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. Dwayne's been doing so much work on this, especially with connecting with our stakeholders, the collaboration efforts, and really pulling in the information from what our other states are doing. So it's been super great. Working with Dwayne, I had quite the crash course in licensure work since I started here in July, and I thank Dwayne for that. There's some really great questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we get to those. But Damon is our next speaker, and Damon, you'll have about 9 to 10 minutes or so we can leave 15 minutes for our questions. Damon is going to be coming at this very much from like a narrative perspective as a recent MSW graduate with his limited LMSW license that he has. Also a Wayne State grad and a University of Michigan grad. So super excited to have Damon here with us, and I'll allow him to introduce himself. But Damon, we would love for you to share your story and your experience as someone who's like very recently going through this process. If you could just share your experiences with the group to tie this all up tonight.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Damon Creighton. Like she said, I'm a recent grad. I've been post-grad for, I think, just about a year now. So I'm currently a general behavior clinician at the Children's Center in Midtown Detroit. I primarily do therapy with kids 7 to 18. And I'm kind of coming to the point where I'm about to start kind of prepping for, the exam. I wanted to really take a year to really prepare, looking at all the statistics of like what the pass rate is. And as a Black man, like transparently, like seeing like those numbers of like the low passing rate is like really intimidating. And I mean, coming from like when I was just a bachelor student, like the one thing that everybody was always hammering down was like, the exam, you got to get all your hours, you got to be ready. And it's like being 2 years postgraduate is like, it would make more sense if it was like right after, considering some of the content. And it's like, okay, I'm fresh out of like this academic mind, but now I'm going into this transitionary part of my life where it's like you're kind of going from being a full-time student to now you're like full-time working and trying to really go through all the confusion and transition of really being like a full regular person. And like now throwing like the monkey in the wrench with the exam aspect. And now it's like, now I have like this stressful job where I'm doing, therapy 8, 9 hours a day. And then now I got to come home and like, I got to put like 2 hours in a day of like trying to like just crunch all of this information in and pay for courses and tutors. And I'm very blessed to have a job where I can get free supervision, but that's not the case for everybody. So like that's a whole nother aspect of like the financial aspect, and then paying for the actual exam itself. And then just seeing some of the questions like Brian showed earlier, like these are questions that like I would need to see a whole biopsychosocial to answer that accurately. Like like a two sentence prompt for this very very loaded question. And it's like, this is a field where you can't just like, there's no one case the same. Like I have 60 kids on my caseload, and there's not a single one who is the same. They could have the same diagnosis, the same background, and every single one of them is different. So it's like, how can we truly like just look at this one thing and be like, wow, okay, this is how everyone should answer this question. And everyone's such a unique social worker too. Like everybody's perspective is different. Everybody's seen and experienced different things. So how they might handle things. Yes. And I just saw a comment, the cost of materials, buying all the books, making me sick to my stomach. But yeah, so I definitely could see how a revised version or an open book could be very beneficial. Because I mean, there's no evidence showing that not having an exam would be like the end of the world also. And I think that's like important, because it's just like, I mean, we see how social workers and all of us show up in all different fields now. And there's some people who aren't even licensed and they're incredible social workers. That doesn't make them any less of a social worker because they didn't, pass this 150 question exam. And like Dean Kubiak said kind of in the beginning, like it's really important that we vote and stay with administrations that care about these issues. Even just seeing like as recent as like Governor Whitmer signing off on different bills that have put in more funding and payment for different field education for master's programs for like school settings. So it's like having people in office that truly represent us and that really want us to put us in the position to help our clients the most, right? Because the same way that we have to advocate for our clients all day, like we're advocating for ourselves at the end of the day. Because if we're not taking care of, how can we pour all of ourselves into our crafts if we are not given the proper materials to do so? So I think that ultimately we just need to continue to be one united voice and continue doing the work, whether it's on the research level, whether it's the boots on the ground, whether you're a student. Like every vote matters, every social worker matters. We are all doing incredible work. And whether you are in your first class of BSW or have been in the field 30, 35 years, like you are so valuable to this profession. And it is so incredible what we can do if we really truly put all of our voices together to do what's best for this profession. Thank you.
Damon, thank you so much. And I don't know if you've seen the chat, but everybody is saying like all the amazing points that you made and how like I think sharing your experience really ties nicely with like Brian with the data points, and then Dwayne with like the background of the policy. Damon, you gave it like a face, like you're the human in action showing like why this is so important. So thank you so much. I'm going to share a couple of slides real quick, and then we're going to open up to some Q&A. I know Brian and Dwayne in particular could talk all night about these issues, so we can always fill it in with some more data points to get us to the end. But Bear with me as I share my screen one more time on some next steps and how folks can get involved. Let me make it full screen so it looks a little bit prettier than this. All right, so as we kind of talked about tonight, there's so many ways that you can get involved starting today. Of course, I don't know if you've heard, but there's an election coming up, right? So November 5th, you can vote on November 5th, but like Representative Brayback mentioned, early voting starts tomorrow in Michigan. There's a lot of municipalities, I think Detroit's one of them, where early voting has already started. But for the rest of Michigan, that period starts tomorrow. So you can vote on or before November 5th. If you are not registered to vote, you can go to your local clerk's office and get registered to vote up until and on election day. And what's great about that is even if you register to vote at your clerk's office that same day, you can cast your vote then and there. So it's not too late. You can write your legislators in support of the licensing bills. I threw the link in the chat to our Voter Voice Legislative Action Center. It's never been easier to write your legislators on the issues that matter to you. And we've really made it easy on that website. And then, of course, you can join a committee or work group with NASW Michigan. We have our Legislative and Social Policy Committee. That's the group that will be shaping the legislative agenda, and we're getting ready to create a new agenda for January 2025. So now is a great time to join that committee. I think I have some links on the next one here. Yep. So if you want to take a quick picture of this, this is all the helpful links if you want to start signing up, getting involved. So votervoice.net/NASW Michigan, that is how you can write your legislators to support our licensing modernization bill. You'll also see we're supporting some other initiatives on our website, so please check that out. You can visit socialwork.wayne.edu and nasw-michigan.org to learn more about what we are doing. And if you want to participate in any of those committees or any upcoming events, visit our events page. Those committees meet once a month, usually around lunchtime. So we try to make it flexible. They're virtual, so we can, work with folks. And then, of course, my email address is below if you ever need to get connected, have any questions. If I can't answer it, maybe I can point you in the right direction. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I would love to open this up for any questions. I saw a question in the chat about Canada. I guess I should have realized that we would have some Canadian students on the call. We are in Michigan, right across the river from Canada. Is anybody on our panel familiar with what Canada is currently doing for licensure, especially with the ASWB exam not meeting the language requirement right now? So is anybody on our panel familiar with that process currently?
I'm not familiar with the exact requirements in, say, Ontario, but I know that broadly Canada has used more of what they term a registration system rather than actual licensure. But over the past decade, partly through some lobbying from the ASWB, they've increasingly incorporated the ASWB exam into that registration process, making it a requirement. So registration is usually a much lower barrier towards meeting those requirements, but I couldn't say for certain what the current requirements in Ontario are, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was going to just add to that too. It's about half of the Canadian provinces and territories require the ASWB exam for one of their levels of licensing. Most of Canada doesn't have an examination for anything outside of the clinical license. And so, but ASWB has been moving to get more of Canada, not surprising, as another market in this. But there are still a good chunk of Canada that does not require any sort of examination as of right now. The other question that I saw that I wanted to touch base on was the question around, can't we just fix the test? Gosh, I wish that was the answer. It would make things so much easier. Or isn't there an alternative that we could just go to? Sadly, no. Like I said, ASWB has a monopoly on this at this point. There's very little incentive financially for them to make structural changes. And I think for the larger social work community, including the schools of social work, NASW, the other social work organizations, there's also a pretty serious trust issue at this point that I don't think many of us would feel confident that they would, in good faith, actually work to enhance the examination. So what I'll say around that is there has been no meaningful moves from ASWB in at least the 2 years since their own data has been released to initiate immediate or long-term solutions to assist test takers to pass the exam or to implement sensible recommendations. And when I say sensible recommendations, 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now, when the data was released nationally, CSWE, the National Dean, a list of recommendations that we said, these are some things that we think you all can do now that aren't going to hit your bottom line, but would make a big difference for test takers in the short term. And that included waiving or significantly reducing retesting fees for social workers who need to take the exam more than one time, making the ASWB practice exam available for free. It's $85 if you take it through their site now. It might even be more now. Immediately remove the requirement that work hours be complete before candidates are eligible to sit for the exam. I saw that a couple of times in the chat. So for folks who have been in the field for more than 4 or 5 years, you used to be able to take the exam immediately upon graduation. ASWB changed that. They said that the exam folks did better when they were in the field longer. No data has shown to back it up. Now that national data is out there, it's clear that that's not actually a reality. We asked for Michigan-specific de-identified data for all questions be released annually so that we may conduct an independent review of the tests. And looking at reviewing pass rate data and maybe expanding the passing score, or looking at going back a couple of years and expanding that window, maybe by a question or two, because a lot of times we're hearing from folks where they failed the exam by 1, 2, 3 questions, and there's no way to take modules. There's no way to go back and look at if they've removed a question 3 years later because they've deemed that it's, you know, racially biased or has racial disparate pass rates. Those sorts of things haven't been taken into serious consideration. I get it from their end that things take time to change. So you may hear some things that sound appealing, like they're going to be moving from 4 questions, 3 or 4 answers to 3 answers. There's no data that says that actually makes anything any better for anybody, but it looks good. But to say that, there's also going to be allegedly scholarships coming out to help repeat test takers. They've been saying that for at least a year now. There's no specifics about when, who, and how that's going to happen. We've met with them. I've met with their CEO, their lobbyists. They have hired a lobbyist in Michigan to fight our efforts because we are one of the largest states that license social workers. So they have a huge financial stake in keeping the system as it is. But even saying that, it's still a struggle to get the folks in the top part of our legislative system, including the executive branch, to get on board, just because it feels much bigger than really it is in practice.
Dwayne, I'm going to jump in real quick. Thank you so much. I just wanted to point out, folks in the chat, Roberto has posted the evaluation link. As we're wrapping up these last few minutes here, if you're here for CEs, please make sure you scroll in the chat to Roberto's link. I don't want anybody missing out, so please make sure you caught that. And a couple more good questions came in. And one of them I want to touch on, and I know Dwayne, Brian, Damon, you might have additional stuff to add to this, but something that came up was the compact, the interstate compact. I sat a few weeks ago, we had, well, not we are not a part of the interstate compact at this time. We've actually found out recently that our current administration here in Michigan actually doesn't like compacts due to like legality. We don't want to get sued, so on and so forth. But we're still interested in the compact because, of course, our social workers are interested in that reciprocity across state lines. The interstate compact just had their first commission meeting maybe about a month ago now. And I think they're going to meet again in maybe 6 months. So it's really just at the very base level right now. Nothing's set in stone. This commission's been set to really establish what the interstate compact is going to look like going forward. Something that we noticed on the call that we attended is ASWB has a very heavy hand in the interstate compact. And part of the interstate compact is there has to be a nationally recognized exam requirement for it. And of course, as it stands, that compact is going with the ASWB exam. Now, there are members, delegates of the compact that have already expressed their disappointment in that. Minnesota is one of the states that are a part of the compact, and they're also one of the states that is moving away, creating this alternative. Rhode Island's also a part of it, and they've just gotten rid of the exam for the time being to address their mental health crisis. So, we care about the compact. We want to pursue the compact, but we really want to address licensing here in Michigan. That's where NASW's efforts currently are. But knowing that ASWB does have such a heavy hand in the compact is like a really interesting twist that I'm not sure we were all expecting with it. But on that first commission call, it's very clear that they have a really strong pull with how the compact is gonna go. So I just wanted to share my thoughts as I attended that commission meeting. Brian, Damon, Dwayne, if you have anything to add, compact is always a great question and a great topic, and I know it really matters to our social workers here.
Thanks, Dana. The only other thing I would add is a consideration to be thinking about. And part of the reason some states, like the governor, are hesitant to move on compacts is, as we've seen specifically over the last couple of years, where there are several states that are moving really extreme conservative bans on things that are related to social work practice, whether that be gender affirming care bans, abortion bans, book bans, all of those sorts of things, that if you're a Michigan licensed social worker and say you're part of a compact, and then you're seeing a client who's in Florida or Ohio or Texas, one of these states that have one of these more extreme legislative climates, could you potentially lose your license because you are violating that state's law? There are some unknowns with that related to compacts, and so there are some legislatures that are hesitant to move forward with compacts in that regard. But I will say, as an NASW chapter, we won't be pushing the compact until we have some licensing reform changes. It doesn't feel ethical to require an examination requirement for one thing and then be trying to remove it in another. So we're very hopeful that the compact commission, as they form and do their work, will create an alternative pathway as more and more states require that in their own state law.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. We have just a few minutes here, and I want to make sure we get this last question here. Let's see. Daphne has a really great question here. I'm not super down with the exam as it exists, and I struggle because I'm not convinced that we are effectively supporting our social workers in our university programs, field placements, and in supervision. As we push for eliminating the licensing exam, how are we building the infrastructure to bolster the quality of these areas? That's a really great question, and I know something that we've been exploring here at NASW Michigan is how can we bolster supervision? Because as it stands in Michigan, when folks are doing their supervision hours, if you see that form, it's literally just a 2-page form, and you're just signing off that Susie Q completed their supervision hours, right? There's really, but we have supervision training and whatnot, but it's not required. So I think something we're hoping to see is how can we really amp up supervision to be that strong support for our social workers, because I think in terms of competency and making sure we have ethical supportive social workers, that supervision piece is really going to come into play, and there needs to be more of an emphasis on providing quality supervision for our folks. Dwayne and Brian or Damon, anything to add to that?
I mean, I think related to supervision, expect to see a survey related to this in the next couple of months, where we want to gather what's been happening in Michigan. We know that we don't have any requirements except for being fully licensed in order to provide supervision. And I definitely think that there will be a push to put in at least suggested training requirements like we have for implicit bias and human trafficking. Not maybe a requirement, but if you're going to be a supervisor, here's what we think you should do. We've been doing internal research about all the other state supervision requirements. About half of the states require some sort of training for folks who are providing supervision. And that ranges from a one-time 1 hour to 45 hours every 3 years. So it's pretty diverse in terms of what we're looking at across the country. But we know that we want to have supervision be strengthened regardless of how we do it. And being intentional that we're not just adding in another financial burden on licensed folks to have to do X amount of training. So looking at other incentives, like maybe making X amount of supervision that's offered also count for continuing education. So you can take off some of your 45 hours from what you're doing in supervision. So yes, we'll definitely have something at our conference in April related to this, but please be on the lookout for some surveys. We'll have probably at least 1 or 2 specific community conversations directly related to supervision. So if you are a supervisor or if you've been through the supervision process and have feedback.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. And I know we are at time. So thank you everybody so much for spending your Friday evening with us. I know it's like the Friday before Halloween and there's probably some other super exciting stuff going on, but I'm so happy and super excited that y'all chose to hang out with us tonight instead. I hope everybody learned and took away something, or maybe you feel validated in your concerns about the exam. Also, yes, Andre, I agree. Professor Judith Weinman from Wayne State University, this was her brainchild. She reached out to me wanting to put something on, so this was really her brainchild. So thank you, Wayne State. Thank you, Dean Kubiak. Thank you, Representative Braybeck, Brian, Damon, Dwayne, everybody on the call. This has been great. This is definitely not the first conversation we'll have, not the last. Make sure you completed that link. If you need your evaluation to complete for your CEs, Wayne State students, we're sending that report over to Wayne State for your extra credit. I'm gonna hang on the line just to make sure people get that evaluation link. And then other than that, have a fabulous night, folks.